There are moments when human cruelty and natural disaster collide in ways that create nightmares, when the worst of humanity meets the fury of nature, when a mother's love becomes the only force powerful enough to fight both. During unprecedented flooding in Montana's Flathead Valley, Wildlife Officer Jake Morrison received an emergency call about distressed bear vocalizations coming from beneath a remote highway bridge. Sounds that didn't match normal bear behavior. Sounds that communicated pure desperation. What Jake found when he arrived defied belief. A 4-month-old grizzly bear cub chained by the neck to a concrete bridge support, rising floodwaters already submerging the cub's body, and the cub's mother, a 400-pound grizzly, standing in chest-deep raging current, physically holding her baby's head above water with her own body, slowly drowning herself to keep her cub alive. The rescue that followed would require split-second decisions, would risk human lives to save bears, and would expose a wildlife trafficking operation that had been operating for years. Subscribe now, because what happened beneath that bridge will haunt you forever and prove that a mother's love transcends species, fear, and even the instinct to survive. Jake Morrison had been a Montana fish, wildlife, and parks officer for 12 years, responding to everything from illegal hunting to bear-human conflicts to vehicle collisions involving wildlife. But nothing in his training prepared him for the emergency call that came during the spring floods of May 2023. "We're getting reports of bear sounds coming from under the Highway 2 bridge near Essex," dispatch reported. "Multiple callers say it sounds like distress vocalizations, not normal behavior. Flood conditions are severe in that area. Water's risen 8 feet above normal levels." Jake knew that bridge. It crossed the middle fork of the Flathead River, a waterway that became a raging torrent during spring snowmelt. With the unprecedented rainfall they'd experienced over the past 72 hours, that river would be life-threatening. Current strong enough to sweep vehicles away, water cold enough to cause hypothermia in minutes. He drove to the bridge location, noting the floodwater covering sections of the highway, debris washing downstream, the raw power of nature unleashed. As he approached the bridge, he heard what the callers had reported, vocalizations that were absolutely bare. But the tone was wrong. These weren't threat sounds or territorial calls. These were distress, desperation, sounds he'd only heard from animals in extreme crisis. Jake parked safely away from the flood zone, grabbed his binoculars, and approached the bridge edge carefully. What he saw when he looked down stopped his heart. A grizzly bear cub, approximately 4 months old and maybe 35 pounds, was chained by a thick metal chain around its neck to one of the concrete bridge support columns. The chain was maybe 4 feet long, short enough that the cub couldn't escape the rising water. The flood had risen so high that the cub was completely submerged except for its head, which was being held above water by its mother. The mother grizzly, approximately 400 pounds, was standing in the raging current that was chest-deep on her massive frame. She had positioned her body against the current, creating a barrier that redirected the water flow, and she was physically using her head and neck to hold her cub's head above the waterline. The cub's body was completely underwater, held against the bridge support by the chain, but its nose and eyes remained above surface because the mother was literally acting as a living platform, keeping her baby alive. Jake's immediate assessment was clinical and horrifying. The mother grizzly had been there for hours, possibly all night, fighting a current that was trying to sweep her away, using her body to protect her cub from drowning. She was exhausted. He could see the strain in her posture, the way she was bracing against the concrete to maintain position, the desperation in how she kept adjusting to keep the cub's face above water as the flood continued to rise. But more horrifying was the chain. This wasn't an accident. No natural situation created a grizzly cub chained beneath a bridge. This was intentional. This was human cruelty, wildlife trafficking, illegal captivity taken to the most brutal extreme. Someone had chained this cub here, either to hide it temporarily or as some sick form of captivity, and when the floods came, they'd left it to drown. "Dispatch, this is Morrison," Jake said into his radio, his voice tight with controlled fury. "I have an emergency wildlife situation at Highway 2 Bridge. Grizzly cub chained to bridge support, actively drowning in floodwater. Mother bear present, also in life-threatening situation. I need immediate backup, swift water rescue team, veterinary emergency, and bolt cutters. This is a rescue operation and a criminal investigation. Someone chained this cub here." "Copy that. All units are deployed to flood emergencies across the county. Estimated response time is 45 minutes minimum." Jake looked at the bears. The water was still rising. The mother was visibly weakening, her body shaking from exhaustion and hypothermia from standing in frigid snowmelt water for hours. The cub was making weak crying sounds, its eyes showing terror and exhaustion. 45 minutes meant they'd both be dead. The mother would lose her strength, the current would sweep her away, and the cub would drown chained to concrete. Jake was looking at a double death sentence playing out in real time unless someone acted immediately. He grabbed his emergency gear from his truck. Bolt cutters designed for removing illegal snares, rope, his personal flotation device, and bear spray. Every protocol said wait for backup, don't enter flood conditions alone, don't approach grizzly bears in crisis situations. But every human instinct, every reason he'd become a wildlife officer, said that Mother had been fighting to save her baby for hours, and if he didn't help her right now, they'd both die. Jake made his choice. He was going into that water. Jake secured the rope to his truck's tow hitch, creating a safety line that would prevent the current from sweeping him downstream. He put on his flotation device, grabbed the bolt cutters, and approached the bridge edge where he could access the water. The current was terrifying, fast, cold, filled with debris that could kill as easily as the water itself. "I'm coming," Jake called down to the bears, not knowing if his voice mattered, but needing to communicate somehow. "I'm going to free your cub." "Don't attack me. I'm here to help." The mother grizzly's eyes tracked him as he descended the embankment into the water. Jake had expected immediate aggression. Mother grizzlies defending cubs were among the most dangerous animals in North America. But she didn't charge, didn't even vocalize defensively. She just watched him, still holding her cub's head above water, her body language showing exhaustion so profound she could barely maintain her stance. The water hit Jake like a wall of ice. The current was stronger than he'd anticipated, immediately trying to sweep his legs out from under him. He held the rope with one hand, bolt cutters in the other, and began wading toward the bridge support where the cub was chained. The mother bear shifted position as Jake approached, moving slightly to give him access to the chain while still supporting her cub. It was deliberate, conscious. She was allowing him near her baby because she understood he was trying to help. The intelligence and trust required for that calculation was staggering. Jake reached the concrete support, bracing himself against it to avoid being swept away. The cub was right there, chained by a heavy metal collar around its neck, the chain secured to an anchor bolt embedded in the concrete. The cub's eyes met Jake's. Pure terror, exhaustion, desperate hope. "I've got you, baby," Jake said, positioning the bolt cutters on the chain. "Your mom brought you help." "She saved you." The chain was thick, designed to hold, not to be removed. Jake squeezed the bolt cutters with everything he had, his arms shaking from cold and effort. The first attempt didn't break it. The second attempt made a partial cut. The mother bear huffed softly, not threateningly, almost like encouragement. Third attempt. The chain snapped. The cub was free. But freedom meant the current immediately tried to sweep the cub downstream. Jake grabbed the cub as it went past, pulling the tiny soaking bear against his chest, holding it above water while the current slammed both of them against the bridge support. The mother bear moved instantly, positioning herself downstream of Jake, using her body as a barrier to break the current's force. She was protecting both of them, her cub and the human saving him. Jake fought his way back along the rope toward the embankment, holding the cub above water, the mother bear staying close, moving with him through the current. When Jake finally reached shallow water and climbed onto the bank, he collapsed with the cub still in his arms, both of them shaking from cold and shock. The mother bear climbed out of the water behind them, so exhausted she could barely stand. She approached Jake slowly, and for a moment he thought this was where his decisions got him killed. He was lying on his back, holding her cub, completely vulnerable to a 400-pound grizzly who'd just survived a traumatic crisis. But she didn't attack. She gently took the cub from Jake's arms with her mouth, carrying him a few feet away, and began frantically grooming him, checking him for injuries, making soft maternal sounds. Then she did something that made Jake's eyes fill with tears. She looked back at him, made a soft huff, and touched her nose briefly to his boot before turning her full attention back to her cub. It was acknowledgement. It was thank you. "You're welcome," Jake whispered, too exhausted and cold to move yet, watching the mother bear tend to her baby with fierce devotion. "You're welcome, Mama Bear. You saved him. You held him alive until help came. You're the hero here." But the crisis wasn't over. Both bears were hypothermic. The cub was injured and possibly had water in his lungs, and the mother bear had been standing in freezing water for so long that her body was shutting down. Jake called dispatch again. "Cub is freed, both bears alive, but they need immediate veterinary intervention." "Where's my backup?" "En route, ETA 20 minutes. Jake used those 20 minutes to do something completely against protocol but absolutely necessary. He built a small fire using emergency supplies from his truck, creating warmth that both bears gravitated toward. The mother bear, who should have been aggressive toward human proximity, instead lay down near the heat with her cub pressed against her, both of them shivering violently. When the veterinary emergency team and backup officers arrived, they found a scene that defied standard wildlife crisis response. Jake Morrison, soaking wet and hypothermic himself, sitting by a small fire with a mother grizzly and her cub lying 10 feet away, all three recovering from near-death experiences together. "Jake, what the hell happened here?" his supervisor, Captain Linda Hayes, demanded as she assessed the situation. You went into flood rescue conditions alone with a grizzly bear? I went into flood rescue conditions to save a drowning cub who was chained here by some bastard wildlife trafficker, Jake corrected, his voice hard. That mother bear spent hours, probably all night, standing in that current holding her baby above water. She was drowning herself to keep him alive. I wasn't going to let them both die because protocol said wait. Dr. Rachel Kim, the emergency wildlife veterinarian, approached the bears cautiously with a tranquilizer rifle. We need to sedate them both for transport and medical evaluation. The cub has likely aspirated water, and the mother is showing signs of severe hypothermia and exhaustion. But getting close enough to tranquilize them was complicated by the fact that the mother bear, despite her exhaustion, was still alert and protective. Every time someone approached, she'd lift her head defensively, positioning herself between her cub and the humans. She trusts Jake, one of the rescue team members observed. Look, she's tracking everyone else defensively, but when Jake moves, she just watches without aggression. Jake understood what needed to happen. He approached the mother bear slowly, talking softly, showing his empty hands. Hey, Mama. These people are here to help both of you. You need a doctor. Your baby needs a doctor. You did your job. You kept him alive until we got here. Now let us help. The mother bear watched him intently. And then, remarkably, when Dr. Kim positioned herself behind Jake and raised the tranquilizer rifle, the mother bear didn't charge or flee. She just kept her eyes on Jake, as if trusting that if he wasn't reacting with fear, neither should she. The tranquilizer dart hit cleanly. Within minutes, the mother bear was sedated safely. The cub was darted with a dosage appropriate for his tiny size, and both bears were loaded onto specialized transport gurneys designed for large predators. Get them to the facility immediately, Dr. Kim instructed. The cub needs chest x-rays to check for pulmonary edema from aspiration. The mother needs warming protocols and organ function panels. They're both critical. While the medical team transported the bears, Jake worked the crime scene. The chain and collar were photographed, collected as evidence. The anchor bolt in the concrete was recent, installed within the last few weeks based on the lack of weathering. This wasn't a temporary setup. Someone had deliberately created a permanent anchoring point for holding wildlife beneath this bridge. Jake found more evidence. Trampled vegetation indicating regular human access to this location, food wrappers suggesting someone had been visiting regularly, and, most damning, a game camera hidden in nearby brush, still recording. Captain, we've got a camera, Jake reported. Whoever did this was monitoring the cub. This is organized wildlife trafficking, not just some idiot's impulsive cruelty. The camera's SD card was seized as evidence. Back at headquarters, Jake reviewed the footage with the investigative team, and what they found was worse than anyone had anticipated. The footage showed a man, approximately 40 years old, arriving at the bridge location 3 weeks earlier with the grizzly cub in a small cage. He'd installed the anchor bolt, chained the cub, left food and water within the cub's limited reach, and returned every few days to check on the cub and provide minimal care. He's holding the cub here temporarily, Captain Hayes analyzed. Probably until he can arrange transport to sell it to illegal exotic pet trade or canned hunting operations. This bridge location is remote, hidden, and he can access it from the highway without drawing attention. but the man's last visit was 5 days before the flood. The footage showed him checking the weather forecast on his phone, showing visible concern about the predicted rain, but then leaving anyway, abandoning the cub to whatever happened. "He knew the flood was coming," Jake said, his voice shaking with rage. "He saw the weather predictions and he left that cub chained there anyway." He left it to drown. The footage also captured the mother bear's arrival. She'd appeared 2 days before the flood, clearly tracking her stolen cub. The camera showed her desperately trying to break the chain, digging around the anchor bolt, biting at the metal collar, attempting everything to free her baby. When the floodwater started rising, the footage showed her staying, refusing to leave, positioning herself to hold her cub above water as the current grew stronger and stronger. "She stood there for 16 hours, Dr. Kim said, reviewing the timestamp data. From the time the water reached critical level until Jake arrived, she maintained that position for 16 hours. The hypothermia, the exhaustion, she should have died. Most animals would have fled to save themselves. She chose to stay and die with her cub rather than abandon him." At the Montana Large Predator Medical Center, both bears were fighting for their lives. The cub, whom the staff named River, had moderate pulmonary edema from aspirated water, severe hypothermia, wounds around his neck from the collar, and was severely underweight from 3 weeks of inadequate nutrition. Dr. Kim intubated him immediately, providing oxygen support and initiating aggressive warming protocols. The mother bear, named Sentinel by the rescue team for her unwavering protective stance, was in even more critical condition. 16 hours of standing in frigid floodwater had caused profound hypothermia. Her core body temperature had dropped to dangerous levels, and preliminary blood work showed early signs of organ stress. She'd also sustained injuries to her paws and legs from bracing against the concrete and current for so long. She burned through every calorie reserve she had, Dr. Kim explained to Jake, who'd insisted on staying despite needing medical attention himself for hypothermia and exhaustion. Her body was eating its own muscle tissue to generate heat and energy to keep functioning. She was literally consuming herself to keep that cub alive. Over the next 72 hours, both bears received intensive care. River's lungs cleared with oxygen therapy and antibiotics preventing secondary infection. Sentinel's body temperature normalized slowly with heated IV fluids and warming blankets. But the most remarkable aspect of their recovery was how they affected each other. Whenever River's vital signs destabilized, which happened multiple times during the first 2 days, Sentinel, despite being heavily sedated in an adjacent recovery unit, would become agitated. Her heart rate would spike, she'd vocalize despite the sedation, and she wouldn't calm until staff wheeled River's incubator to where she could see him through observation glass. "The bond between them is so strong it's overriding sedation," Dr. Kim documented. "Sentinel is somehow aware when River is in distress, even though they're in separate units. We're going to have to adjust treatment protocols to keep them in visual contact. By day 5, both bears had stabilized enough to be housed together in a large recovery enclosure." The moment they were reunited, Sentinel's improvement accelerated dramatically. She began eating voluntarily, her activity levels increased, and most importantly, she resumed normal maternal care behaviors, grooming River, sleeping curled around him, making soft vocalizations that clearly communicated comfort and reassurance. River thrived with his mother. Within 2 weeks, he'd gained 8 pounds, his neck wounds had healed cleanly, and he was exhibiting normal cub behavior, playing, exploring, showing curiosity about his environment. But he also showed clear trauma responses. He was terrified of rain, panicked when water levels rose in his habitat pool, and required constant proximity to Sentinel to feel secure. This cub will carry psychological scars from this trauma, Dr. Kim told the rehabilitation team. He was chained, separated from his mother, nearly drowned, and then witnessed his mother almost die saving him. Young animals experiencing this level of trauma often develop lasting behavioral changes. River will need extensive rehabilitation to prepare him for eventual release. Meanwhile, Jake's investigation had identified the suspect. The game camera footage was matched through facial recognition to Marcus Webb, a 42-year-old man with prior convictions for wildlife trafficking and illegal hunting. A warrant was issued, and Webb was arrested at his property 2 counties away. The search of Webb's property uncovered a full-scale wildlife trafficking operation. Cages, tranquilizer equipment, records of sales to exotic animal dealers across the country, and evidence of multiple prior bear cub captures. Webb had been operating for at least 5 years, stealing cubs and selling them to illegal pet operations and canned hunting facilities where captive bred bears were released in enclosures for wealthy hunters to shoot. This is one of the largest wildlife trafficking busts in Montana history, Captain Hayes announced during a press conference. Marcus Webb is facing federal charges including illegal take of threatened species, wildlife trafficking, animal cruelty, and felony abandonment, resulting in endangered wildlife. If convicted on all counts, he's looking at 15 years minimum. But for Jake, the legal victories mattered less than the bear's recovery. He visited Sentinel and River regularly during their rehabilitation, and every time he appeared, Sentinel would approach the observation fence and make that soft huff sound, the same sound she'd made when she'd touched his boot after the rescue. "She remembers you," Dr. Kim said during one visit. "Grizzlies have excellent memory, especially for significant events tied to survival. You saved her cub. She'll remember you for the rest of her life." The rehabilitation of Sentinel and River lasted 6 months, longer than typical bear rehabilitation, because both animals needed to overcome not just physical injuries, but profound psychological trauma. River needed to relearn that water was safe, that chains didn't mean captivity, that humans at a distance weren't threats. Sentinel needed to recover her strength, regain the weight she'd lost during her ordeal, and demonstrate she could still successfully teach River wild survival skills despite their traumatic experience. The facility implemented a specialized rehabilitation protocol designed specifically for their case. River was gradually introduced to water through shallow pools, then streams, always with Sentinel present to provide security. The sessions were carefully monitored. At first, River would panic at the sound of running water, but with his mother's calm presence, he slowly learned that not all water meant drowning. "This is remarkable progress," Dr. Kim documented during week 12. "River is now voluntarily swimming in the habitat stream, catching fish with Sentinel's guidance, showing completely normal bear water behavior. The trauma hasn't been erased, but he's learned to function despite it. That's resilience." Sentinel proved to be an exceptional mother and teacher. She demonstrated fishing techniques, showed River how to forage for roots and insects, taught him climbing skills on the facility's artificial rock structures. But she also remained hypervigilant. Any time River was out of her sight, she'd vocalize urgently until she could see him again. The trauma had intensified her already strong maternal protective instincts. During rehabilitation, River grew from 35 pounds to nearly 90 pounds. A healthy, thriving juvenile grizzly showing all appropriate wild behaviors. Sentinel regained her pre-trauma weight of 420 pounds and demonstrated complete physical recovery. Both bears were assessed as ready for release consideration. But release planning for trauma survivors was complex. Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks had to identify release territory that was secure from human threats, had excellent habitat, and wasn't controlled by territorial male bears who might kill River. They also had to consider that both bears now had modified responses to humans, not dangerous habituation, but recognition that specific humans had helped them. Standard protocol says bears with positive human contact can't be released due to habituation risks, Captain Hayes explained during the review meeting. But this case is unique. They don't seek humans. They avoid people appropriately. The only human they show recognition toward is Jake, and that's because he literally saved their lives. That's not habituation. That's memory and appropriate assessment. The decision was made to release them in the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex. 1.5 million acres of protected wilderness with excellent grizzly habitat, minimal human presence, and strong legal protections against hunting and harassment. The release would be soft, meaning they'd be transported to the site, released together, and monitored via GPS collars for the first year to ensure successful wild adaptation. Jake was invited to participate in the release, and he accepted immediately. On a clear September morning, 6 months after the rescue, Sentinel and River were transported via helicopter to a remote valley deep in the Bob Marshall Wilderness. The transport crates were positioned in a meadow surrounded by prime grizzly habitat, streams for fishing, berry patches for foraging, dense forest for denning. When the crates opened, River emerged first, cautious but curious, testing the air, recognizing the scents of true wilderness. Sentinel followed immediately, moving to her cub, sniffing him thoroughly, assessing the new environment. Jake watched from the helicopter at a safe distance. He'd done his job, saved them, helped them heal, and now he was setting them free to live as wild bears should. It was success, but it also felt like saying goodbye to individuals he'd bonded with through shared trauma. Sentinel looked toward the helicopter briefly. Even at that distance, Jake could swear she made eye contact, held it for 3 seconds, then turned and led River toward the forest. They walked together, mother and cub, survivors, heading into wilderness that would be their home. "That's it," the pilot said. "They're wild again." But Jake knew it was more complex than that. They weren't just wild. They were wild bears who'd survived human cruelty, natural disaster, and near death, who'd been saved through intervention, and who carried those experiences forward into their wild lives. Their story wasn't just about rescue. It was about resilience. GPS collar data tracked Sentinel and River throughout their first year in the wilderness, documenting their successful adaptation to wildlife. Sentinel established a home range of approximately 50 square miles, typical for female grizzlies, centered around an area with excellent salmon streams and diverse food sources. River remained with his mother through that first year, learning advanced survival skills while gradually gaining independence. The data showed they were thriving, moving naturally, avoiding human areas, denning successfully through their first winter. Trail cameras positioned throughout the wilderness occasionally captured footage of them. Sentinel fishing in autumn streams, River growing into a powerful juvenile, both demonstrating completely appropriate wild behavior. But researchers noticed something unique in their movement patterns. While they avoided human-occupied areas appropriately, they showed no fear response to wildlife cameras or remote monitoring equipment. Most wild bears actively avoided cameras after detecting them, but Sentinel and River seemed to tolerate technological presence in ways other bears didn't. They're distinguishing between direct human presence and human technology, Dr. Kim theorized during a research presentation. They learned during rehabilitation that cameras, GPS collars, and monitoring equipment don't mean danger. They've adapted to accept observation without losing their essential wariness of actual humans. That's sophisticated threat assessment. By River's second year, he began the natural process of separating from Sentinel, spending days away exploring his own territory, returning less frequently, establishing independence. By age 3, he'd fully dispersed, establishing territory 30 miles from Sentinel's range, exactly what successful wild rehabilitation looked like. Sentinel continued thriving in her territory. She was observed mating with a large dominant male during breeding season, and the following spring, trail cameras captured her with 2 new cubs. She was raising another litter, teaching them the same survival skills she'd taught River, passing forward the knowledge that had kept her alive through impossible circumstances. "This is full circle success," Jake said, reviewing the footage of Sentinel with her new cubs. She survived trauma, raised River successfully, released him to independence, and now she's contributing to wild grizzly population recovery with a new litter. This is what conservation success looks like. Marcus Webb's trial concluded with conviction on all counts. He received 12 years in federal prison, lifetime ban from wildlife, related activities, and court-ordered restitution to fund bear conservation programs. The trial generated national media attention, exposing the illegal wildlife trade network Webb had been part of and leading to additional arrests of dealers and buyers across multiple states. Webb's conviction sent a message, Captain Hayes stated during a wildlife law enforcement conference. Wildlife trafficking isn't a minor crime. It's a federal felony with serious consequences. The Sentinel and River case became the catalyst for broader enforcement actions that have disrupted trafficking networks operating for decades. But beyond the legal victories and conservation success, the story resonated with people worldwide for a simpler reason. It was proof that maternal love could overcome anything: chains, floods, hypothermia, the human cruelty that had created the crisis in the first place. The footage of Sentinel standing in that current, holding her cub above water for 16 hours, became one of the most shared wildlife videos in history. Schools used the story in curricula about wildlife conservation and maternal instinct. Therapists referenced it when working with parents navigating impossible situations. Conservation groups used it in fundraising campaigns, and it generated over $2 million in donations to bear protection programs. Jake received multiple awards for his rescue actions, but he remained uncomfortable with the hero narrative. Sentinel was the hero, he'd tell anyone who'd listen. She's the one who stood in that water all night. She's the one who refused to give up. I just cut a chain. She did everything else. 5 years after the rescue, Jake was conducting routine wildlife surveys in the Bob Marshall Wilderness when his truck broke down on a remote access road. While waiting for assistance, he saw movement in the tree line. A large female grizzly, approximately 450 pounds, with two 3-year-old cubs. Jake grabbed his binoculars and confirmed what he'd suspected. Sentinel, now 9 years old, healthy and powerful, with her second litter now almost independent. She was approximately 80 yards away, foraging with her cubs, showing them how to dig for roots. And then Sentinel did something that made Jake's breath catch. She looked directly at his truck, stood briefly on her hind legs, that assessment posture bears used to gather information, and made a vocalization that carried clearly across the distance. Not aggression, not warning, just acknowledgement. "I see you too," Jake said quietly. "You're doing great, Mama. Your cubs are beautiful. You survived, and you're thriving." Sentinel dropped to all fours, led her cubs back into dense timber, and disappeared. Jake never saw her again, but he'd carry that moment forever. The recognition in her eyes, the vocalization that said she remembered, the choice to acknowledge him before moving on with her wild life. Jake Morrison continued his wildlife officer career for another decade, responding to hundreds of wildlife emergencies, but no case ever matched the intensity or emotional impact of Sentinel and River. He eventually became a trainer for wildlife rescue operations, using their case as the centerpiece of his curriculum on emergency response protocols and the complex decisions officers faced when protocol conflicted with immediate life-saving necessity. The book says, "Wait for backup," Jake would tell new recruits during training. But the book doesn't account for a mother bear drowning herself to keep her cub alive while you watch. Sometimes the right decision is the one that breaks the rules, and you have to be willing to accept the consequences of that choice. I'd make the same decision again, every time. River was tracked via GPS collar until age 7, when the collar's battery finally died. His last known location was in prime grizzly territory in Glacier National Park, where he'd established himself as a dominant male, mated successfully with multiple females, and contributed to the genetic diversity of the protected grizzly population. Researchers estimated he'd fathered at least 12 cubs across 4 different litters, a conservation success story multiplied across generations. Sentinel lived to age 14, a respectable lifespan for a wild grizzly, and raised a total of 3 litters, contributing 9 cubs to the wild population over her lifetime. Her final GPS signal indicated she'd died during winter hibernation, peacefully in her den, having lived a full wild life after surviving what should have been a death sentence. The bridge where the rescue occurred became an unofficial memorial site. Wildlife advocates installed a plaque, "Sentinel's Bridge," in memory of a mother's love that conquered chains, floods, and human cruelty. May we honor her sacrifice by protecting the wild places and wild lives that depend on our compassion. Dr. Kim published multiple research papers on Sentinel and River's case, analyzing the physiological resilience that allowed Sentinel to survive 16 hours of hypothermic immersion, the psychological recovery protocols that helped River overcome trauma, and the long-term success of their wild rehabilitation. The papers became foundational texts in wildlife medicine and trauma rehabilitation programs worldwide. What Sentinel taught us, Dr. Kim wrote in her final analysis, is that maternal bonds in large predators are more powerful than we've credited. She made a calculated decision to stay with her chained cub, knowing it would likely kill her. She chose death with her baby over survival without him. That's not instinct. That's love, in its purest, most sacrificial form. And when humans honored that love by intervening to save them both, we proved that conservation isn't just about species preservation. It's about recognizing individual animals as beings worthy of extraordinary effort. The illegal wildlife trafficking network that Marcus Webb belonged to was largely dismantled through investigations triggered by his arrest. 12 additional traffickers were convicted, 34 captive bears were rescued from illegal facilities and placed in sanctuaries, and federal funding for wildlife crime enforcement was increased significantly. Webb thought that cub was merchandise, Captain Hayes said during a retirement interview years later. He didn't see Sentinel as a mother who would risk everything. He didn't anticipate that a wildlife officer would risk his life for bears. He underestimated both bear intelligence and human compassion. That underestimation destroyed his operation and saved dozens of animals. For the people who followed their story, and millions did, through documentaries, news coverage, and social media, Sentinel and River became symbols of resilience, of maternal devotion, of the possibility that humans could choose to be rescuers rather than destroyers. Teachers showed the rescue footage to discuss empathy and moral courage. Parents referenced Sentinel when explaining unconditional love. Conservation groups used their images in campaigns that generated ongoing support for wildlife protection. Jake retired at 55, burned out from years of witnessing wildlife suffering caused by human activity. But he remained connected to conservation work, volunteering with bear protection organizations and speaking at schools about wildlife coexistence. He kept one photograph on his desk. Sentinel standing in the floodwater, her body positioned to hold River above the surface, her eyes showing exhaustion and determination in equal measure. People ask if saving 2 bears mattered in the bigger picture, Jake would say, looking at that photograph. They point out that grizzlies are recovering, that 2 individuals don't impact population numbers significantly. But conservation isn't just about numbers and populations. It's about recognizing that each individual matters, each mother fighting for her cub, each baby facing death, each life worth saving. Sentinel mattered. River mattered. The cubs they went on to produce mattered. And the lesson their story taught, that cruelty can be defeated by compassion, that chains can be broken, that mothers will fight impossible odds for their children. That lesson matters most of all. The wilderness holds their story now. The mother who chose drowning over abandonment, the cub who survived because of that choice, and the human who saw their desperate need and responded with courage instead of protocol. Some bonds are forged in crisis and last forever. Some rescues change everyone involved. Some stories prove that when maternal love meets human compassion, miracles happen even beneath bridges, even in floods, even when chains and cruelty try to destroy hope. Sentinel stood in that water for 16 hours, saying, "I will not leave my baby." Jake entered that water saying, "I will not let you both die." And together, they proved that the most powerful force in nature isn't the flood or the chain. It's love refusing to surrender, even when surrender would be easier, even when fighting means risking everything, even when the world says survival requires abandoning those you love most. Their story echoes still in every rescue, every mother's sacrifice, every human choice to help instead of turning away. Because Sentinel and River survived. Because love won. Because sometimes, against impossible odds, the chain breaks and the current doesn't win, and the mother and baby both go home together into wilderness where they belong, carrying forward the knowledge that when everything was at stake, compassion answered their desperate need. If this story broke your heart and rebuilt it, if it showed you that maternal love recognizes no limits and human compassion can break any chain, if it proved that one person's courage can save lives that everyone else said weren't worth the risk, leave a comment about a time you witnessed love that refused to quit. And if you believe that every life, human or animal, convenient or complicated, deserves someone willing to fight for it, hit that subscribe button. Because Sentinel stood in that water for 16 hours, and Jake went in after them both, and together they proved that heroism is choosing action when indifference would be easier. Thank you for witnessing their extraordinary survival. May we all have Sentinel's courage to stay when leaving would be easier, and Jake's compassion to help when protocol says wait.